If you hack the Vatican server, have you tampered in God's domain? Aaron Alston. The Vatican is one of the smallest and largest nations at the time, bizarrely. From government to politics and society, it blurs a line between what we consider geopolitical power. Given that so much discussion about the Vatican is deeply controversial for various reasons, I'm going to try my best to be as objective as possible and discuss the geopolitics of the Vatican, not the religion of the Vatican, because after all, this is not Reddit circa 2009. The Holy See is the smallest nation on the planet by land size. It really lacks its own military, for obvious reasons given the age. It lacks its own border security, its own female population, sorry ladies, it even lacks its own native population. It lacks any real border security unless you count the walls, but then again, it's not as though the Italian military is going to invade the Vatican anytime soon. The southeast of the nation contains St. Peter's Basilica as well as St. Peter's Square, as long as various palaces. Aside St. Peter's Basilica lays a number of gardens along with civic administration buildings. To the north lies various tourist amenities like gift shops as well as the Vatican Museum. The Vatican is one of only two other micronations situated completely within another country's territory. One of the others is San Marino, also in Italy. Due to its small size and its lack of strategic depth, this is pretty much a death sentence if it gets invaded. However, this is highly unlikely. Under your typical geopolitical circumstances, this would be a nightmare. But this is no typical geopolitical circumstance. St. Peter, Jesus' apostle, became the first pope and really set up the institutions of the church. Much of the credit in the Bible usually goes to St. Paul, who played a pivotal role in spreading Christianity and its theological ideas and concepts. However, on the institutional earthly level, Peter played the bigger role. St. Peter was eventually crucified upside down. However, Christianity grew nonetheless and eventually became the official religion of the Roman Empire under Emperor Constantine. Constantine also founded the city of Constantinople, which is now Istanbul, when it got overtaken by the Turks. When it was first founded, it eventually rose to be a prominent city, and eventually led to the schism of the Roman Empire, as the empire at one point was too large to manage, so the West and East split off. In the East, you pretty much had a consolidation of political and religious power. However, in the West, you soon saw the collapse of the Roman Empire there, and as a result, you saw a fracturing between the religious authority of the Catholic Church and the various political entities such as kings and nobles. The kings and nobles could be excommunicated by the Church, thereby increasing the Pope's power and making him the head honcho on the western half of the European continent. Contrary to popular belief, the Catholic Church actually played a larger role in preserving scientific knowledge than suppressing it, as monks were re-recording a lot of the scripts from the Greeks and Arabs. Later issues like Galileo under house arrest would be the exception rather than the norm. Eventually, the papal states emerged to basically consolidate power of the Church without excess control from the various Germanic tribes or the Eastern Roman Empire. The Vatican faced another threat: the rise of Islam. The rise of Islam spread throughout the Middle East and was knocking on the doorstep of the Eastern Roman Empire. And while the Vatican did not like the Eastern Roman Empire, at least they were Christian. So the Pope declared Deus Vult on behalf of the Eastern Roman Empire to defend the Holy Land, namely Jerusalem, from the Muslims. This brought many Christians in contact with the, at the time, far more advanced Muslim world, and thereby did lead to some questioning of Vatican authority. The Crusades, for the most part, with some minor successes, failed overall. On top of that, the Catholic Church failed to really provide much of any leadership during the Great Bubonic Plague, as well as various bickering between various popes and controversies of corruption within Vatican City. This led to the Protestant Reformation, in which, first and foremost, Martin Luther issued a bunch of demands to basically reform the Catholic Church from within. However, he was excommunicated, and he, along with others, started the Protestant Reformation, Protestant because they protested. Thankfully for the Catholic Church, Spain and Portugal, both Catholic nations, ended up conquering much of the Americas, and later in the case of Spain, the Philippines, bolstering Catholic power to the world that stands to this day. A greater threat would emerge, the Age of Enlightenment, which proposed that faith and authority were not the main ways to discover the truth, but rather through scientific inquiry, logic, and reason. Many would begin to question theocracy and advocate for secular governments. It's worth keeping in mind that the Italian peninsula throughout the most of history after the collapse of Rome was fractured, and the Catholic Church wanted to keep its own autonomy. However, the unification of Italy was at loggerheads with this. The Italians wanted to have some of the power over the Catholic Church, but at the same time they wanted to respect the soft power and the faith behind the Catholic Church. The Vatican would have to later adopt much of the secular laws, however be under the protection of Italy, with receiving some personal autonomy under Mussolini. Speaking of Mussolini, the Catholic Church kind of had to be neutral during World War II. On one hand, the Catholic Church did try to assuage some of the resentment coming from the fascist Italian government and the Germans by not going full-blown anti-fascism, but at the same time they did try to help Jews and other oppressed people such as mentally disabled or physically disabled handicapped people from the wrath of the fascists, but at the same time many of the Allies viewed this as insufficient. While the church was mildly anti-fascist, it was far more fervently anti-communist, especially during the Cold War era, as while Marxism and the Catholic Church share many values when it comes to aiding the poor, the Catholic Church could not tolerate the state atheism and repression of communism. During the 1960s, there was vast social changes, and the Catholic Church had to adapt to this through the Second Vatican Council, in which they softened many of their stances when it came to other religions, minorities, women's rights, and to a far, far, far lesser extent, reproductive rights. Eventually, Pope John Paul II became, Pope, and he was from Poland, a current communist country at the time, and he was fervently anti-communist and tried his best to form a sort of alliance with the capitalist West to quash down communist oppression. Then came the conservative Pope Benedict, who resigned after an inability to deal with the rising levels of modernity in the Catholic Church, and he was eventually replaced with Pope Francis, who has been known for being particularly media savvy, particularly on social media. Pope Francis has been quite successful in walking a tightrope between maintaining the traditions of Catholicism while at the same time dealing with modernity. Let's switch to modern demographic, society, and governance. On one hand, the Catholic Church is very small, only around 600 plus people. It has no female citizens, no native-born citizens, no children. But if you count the flock of actual Catholics around the world, it's around 1 billion, making it in the top 3 countries in the world. The Vatican doesn't really have its own military, as, the average age of the place is probably like 80. However, it does have a guardsmanship called the Swiss Guard. The Swiss Guard's orange and purple pantaloons probably make for bleak camouflage prospects, which means that the Italian military pretty much protects Vatican City. The Vatican is one of the most hierarchical religious institutions, or religious belief systems, as the Pope is at the top and is deemed to be infallible since the 19th century, issuing decrees from his throne-type chair. The Pope is both a religious figure and a political figure, controlling matters on earth as the king of the Vatican, but also managing his connection between heaven and earth. The legal jurisdiction of which he reigns over is called the Holy See, and he is also the Archdiocese of Rome, which in turn is the head honcho of the entire Catholic Church. So he pretty much has multiple titles in one. While most Catholics are quote-unquote Roman Catholics, there are numerous Catholics or Catholic churches that fall under Eastern Catholic traditions, but are in full correspondence with the Pope rather than the Orthodox churches. Some of these Eastern Catholic churches maintain some quasi-autonomy with some specific rituals and customs in place relevant to their specific cultures. The two most notable are the Maronite Catholics in Lebanon and the Armenian Catholic Church. At the end of the day, all roads lead to Rome, and under the Pope are the cardinals, and under the cardinals are the archdioceses, who run the dioceses, which correspond to various geographic regions. And under them are further subgroups like priests and then deacons, and then the flock as a whole. As you can see, it's very hierarchical. This system tends to value education and merit, which can be great, but it also tends to be very rigid and hierarchical and very inflexible to changes in the modern world, as well as very insular. Healthcare and educational institutions are also part of the Vatican's power structure. There is also a diplomatic aspect, as the Vatican also manages its own foreign affairs, with countries like China, for example. However, some of its relationships are better than others. For the most part, it gets along pretty well with most countries, namely Italy, which provides its defense and almost everything else, including its utilities. It is not a member of the European Union, as it's not a democracy or really fully functioning state. It's not a member of NATO, as it doesn't even have a military, and it's not even a member of the UN. It's actually an observer state. However, it has played a significant role in foreign policies, such as opposing communism during the Cold War, opposing the Iraq War, helping the poor, to a degree, opposing birth control around the world, and mediating conflicts, for example, between the US and Cuba. One frosty relationship has been the Vatican and the People's Republic of China, due to the heavy-handed force the Communist Chinese Party has had within Catholic affairs within China itself. However, this has thawed due to the Chinese Communist Party allowing the Catholic Church to accept or veto certain pro-Chinese Communist Party officials within the Catholic Church within China. Its economy is even weirder. It's not part of the EU, yet it has its own bank with its own euros. Funny enough. Its coins are collector's items pretty much rather than currency, and it makes a lot of its revenue from museum ticket sales and souvenir purchases, not to mention the massive amount of donations it gets from Catholics all around the world. However, the costs of art restoration are very high. In more recent years, the Catholic Church has been under countless controversies over corruption and a lack of transparency. The Catholic Church also owns a very large array of gold reserves and real estate dealings all around the world. The Catholic Church faces numerous threats, namely the rise of secularism, particularly in mainland Western Europe. Church attendance has been in a staggering state of decline in much of Europe, and to a much lesser extent, the United States and other Western nations. Less and less Europeans are claiming that faith plays an important role in their lives. However, there are some exceptions to this. For example, Poland still tends to be fairly religious compared to the rest of Europe. With the collapse of communism and far less prominently the new atheist movement, it's not so much hostility towards Catholicism that is the issue, but rather apathy towards it. Hot-button issues like sex ed, gay rights, trans rights, reproductive rights, etc. have really put a damper on the Catholic Church, particularly in the West, among populations of millennials and Zoomers. This most well prominently seen in Ireland, where a predominantly Catholic country became far more secular within the course of a generation. This brings up key issues like tradition versus modernity, among others. But even in other places like Latin America, a once Catholic bastion, you've seen the rise of Protestant Christianity. Many Latinos and Latinas find evangelicalism to be far more dynamic than the rigid Catholic Church. Many Protestant evangelical churches have appealed to many people in the developing world as they have less of a rigid hierarchy, are more transparent, and generally speaking have a more modern aesthetic with guitars and keyboards playing at sermons rather than organs. In many ways, the Vatican Church is far more liberal than evangelicals. However, they lack the aesthetic and media savviness to appeal to a large swath of younger people. But all of this pales in comparison to the child PDF file controversies, which you can look into on your own time, which have greatly deflated the Catholic Church's stance of being a moral beacon. Many Westerners are finding meaning and purpose in Eastern religions, New Age spirituality, various hobbies, subcultures, and political culture wars rather than the sort of old school Catholicism. However, this trend could reverse due to the lower birth rates of secular people, as well as the meaning crisis that has prevailed in many secular countries. However, the Catholic Church is doing very well in other parts of the world, such as sub-Saharan Africa, as they happen to have rising birth rates. And I would be shocked if, in my lifetime, there wasn't an African pope. This might seem progressive, however, it could also not be. After all, a lot of Africans are very conservative on social issues, and rising power in Africa among the Vatican Church could tilt them more in the conservative direction. Another ace in the Catholic sleeve is their immense amount of power in educational and healthcare institutions all around the world, particularly among young people. Overall, the previous Pope, Benedict, failed to walk the tightrope between modernity and tradition. Pope Francis has done a much better job. However, we'll have to wait and see on how successful he really will be. Some have compared Pope Francis to Gorbachev, the last premier of the communist Soviet Union, who instituted reforms to soften communism and the authoritarianism of his nation. But this eventually led to the collapse of communism, and some have claimed that this too will happen with Pope Francis and the Vatican Church. As it opens up, its walls will collapse. Apparently. This could well be the case, or it could not. After all, the longevity of the Vatican is pretty staggering. This is an institution that has survived Germanic barbarians, the Huns, Islam, the Protestant Reformation, the Scientific Revolution, the Age of Enlightenment, various European conflicts, fascism, communism, and yes, even atheist neckbeards on Reddit. All of this for a country that is roughly the same size as SeaWorld Orlando, with a population that you can fit in a SeaWorld stadium. And that's pretty staggering. So I want to hear your thoughts. Do you think that the Vatican will maintain its power throughout the ages, or do you think it will crumble into oblivion, or most likely something in between? Thanks for watching. Goodbye.